The bones had been coming out of the ground for over 150 years. Saber-tooth fossils turned up in Spanish caves, in European riverbeds, in the tar-soaked ground of Los Angeles, in the frozen permafrost of the Canadian North. By the early 21st century, science had accumulated more physical evidence on the saber-tooth than on virtually any other extinct predator in history. Thousands of specimens, hundreds of papers, entire museum wings dedicated to the animal, and yet, despite all of it, a single fundamental question had never been answered. What exactly was the saber-tooth related to? It sounds like a question that should have been settled long ago. The saber-tooth looks like a cat. It has a cat's body plan, a cat's skull, geometry, a cat's general proportions. For most of scientific history, the obvious conclusion was that it sat somewhere on the cat family tree, probably near the top, probably as an ancestor or close relative of the largest cats alive today. The size matched, the build matched. The dental architecture, while extreme, fit the general pattern of a large predatory felid. Researchers drew evolutionary trees placing the saber-tooth adjacent to lions and tigers. It was assumed, not seriously questioned. The case felt closed before anyone had the tools to actually lose it. Then, in 2020, a team at the University of Copenhagen did something that had never been done before. They extracted the complete nuclear genome from a saber-tooth fossil recovered from the Yukon permafrost, a specimen of Homotherium latidens that was at least 4,700 years old, so ancient it could not be dated by standard radiocarbon methods. They assembled its full genetic code, and then they did what every comparative genomic study ultimately does. They compared it, methodically, against every living cat species on Earth. The result did not match anything anyone had predicted. The analysis showed that the saber-toothed cat is very distantly related to all modern cats. They diverged from the ancestors of living cat-s around at least 22.5 million years ago, a gap so large that, for comparison, humans and gibbons split between only 15 and 20 million years ago. This was not a minor revision to the existing story. It was a demolition of the existing story. The saber-tooth was not a prototype F, or lions and tigers. It was not an ancestor of anything alive today. It was something else entirely. A parallel experiment in predatory sign that ran alongside the cat family for tens of millions of years without ever merging with it, and then ended. To understand why this result was so unexpected, you have to understand what was being measured and why anatomy had been so misleading for Essie. Oh, long. When paleontologists built evolutionary trees from fossil evidence, they used physical traits, bone structure, skull shape, dental morphology, limb proportions. These were the only tools available, and they were good tools. They produced reasonable results across many animal families. The saber-tooth's anatomy consistently pointed toward the large cat lineage. The skull proportions tracked with lions. The body mass S overlapped with tigers. The long canines, while extreme, fit the template of an ambush predator, in the same family as leopards. Every physical measurement said this animal belongs near the top of the cat family tree. What anatomy could not measure was genetic distance. Two animals can evolve strikingly similar physical forms through completely independent predates, a phenomenon called convergent evolution, and their DNA will reveal the truth that their bones conceal. The saber-tooth's teeth were an extreme version of a lion's teeth. They were a completely separate evolutionary solution to the same problem, developed by a lineage that had already been genetically isolated for millions of years, before the lion's ancestors even existed. The researchers extracted DNA from a Homotherium fossil, recovered from Pleistocene permafrost sediments near Dawson City, Yukon Territory, CKA. Nada. A specimen so old it could not be dated using conventional radiocarbon dating. What they were working with was ancient DNA, fragile molecular material that had survived inside the fossil's bone matrix for nearly 50,000 years in frozen ground. Extracting it required some of the most advanced techniques in modern genomic science. The key was locating the densest, most protected sections of bone, areas of the skull shielding the inner ear, where genetic material survives conditions that destroy it everywhere else. Even then, what survives is not intact DNA. It is thousands of short, broken fragments. The lab work involved capturing those fragments, sequencing them, and then computationally reassembling them into something coherent enough to compare against a living animal's genome. For the first time, researchers succeeded in mapping the entire nuclear genome of a saber-toothed cat, Homotherium latidens, and their DNA, century, revealed what genes were highly selected upon and important in the evolution of the species. That distinction matters. Previous ancient DNA studies of saber-tooth relatives had worked only from mitochondrial DNA, genetic material inherited from a single maternal line, useful beauty incomplete. The nuclear genome is the full picture. It contains both parental lineages. It holds the complete evolutionary signature. It is, by a wide margin, the richer dataset. And it is the dataset that made the comparison against every living cat species meaningful enough to produce a result this precise. What the team was looking for when they ran their comparisons was genetic distance, a numerical measure of how many accumulated differences separate two species from their last shared ancestor. The greater the distance, the older the divergence. Run that calculation across ever, living cat, and rank the results, and you have a map of which animal shares the deepest common origin with the saber-tooth. Going into the study, the expectation was that something large would come up closest, something in the lion or tiger lineage, something the anatomy had been pointing at for a century and a half. What actually came back challenged every assumption that had shaped the field since the first saber-tooth bone was pulled from the ground. The ranked list came back with a clear pattern, and the pattern was almost uniform. Species after species, from lions to tigers to leopards to cheetahs to sandcats to fishing cats, all returned genetic distances from the saber-tooth genome that were strikingly similar to one another. Not identical, but close enough that no obvious candidate stood out. The entire living cat family, across its full range of sizes and geographies and ecological roles, sat at roughly the same remove from the saber-tooth's DNA. That uniformity was itself informative. It confirmed the depth of the split. When every living species scores similarly, it means they all descended from a lineage that separated from the saber-tooth long before any of them had yet diverged from each other. The saber-tooth's branch high had already been running independently for millions of years before the cat family even began producing the species we recognize today. But the list was not perfectly uniform. One species returned a consistently smaller distance than all the others, not dramatically smalls. EM tested. When you are working across a divergence of more than 20 million years, even a modest reduction in genetic distance is significant. It represents millions of years of difference in when a lineage departed from the common ancestral stock. And that speck eyes, the one that returned the smaller distance, the one that had departed from the ancestral line earliest, the one whose DNA had synced, i.e. closest to the starting point before the cat family began diversifying, was not a lion. It was not a tiger. It was an animal that most people, if asked to name the relatives of the saber-tooth, would never think to mention. It was the clouded leopard. The clouded leopard lives in the dense tropical and subtropical forests of Southeast Asia, ranging across parts of Nepal, southern China, and down through the Malay Peninsula into Borneo and Sumatra. It is a medium-sized cat, heavier than a house cat, considerably lighter than a leopard. It spends a large portion of its life in the forest canopy, moving through trees with an agility that ground-dwelling cats cannot match, aided by a proportionally long tail and highly flexible ankle joints that allow it to descend headfirst from vertical surfaces. In photographs, it looks beautiful and unusual. Dense cloud-shaped markings on a tawny coat, a broad face, and a stock Y build that makes it look somehow both ancient and approachable. It does not look like what you would expect the closest living gene tick link to an apex Pleistocene predator to look like. But geneticists and taxonomists had been quietly noting something unusual about the clouded leopard for decades before the saber-tooth genome study was ever run. The first split from the ancestral cat lineage occurred approximately 10.8 million years ago, producing the 5 great roaring cats of the genus Panthera and the earliest offshoot, the 2 clouded leopard species. That placement at the high base of the Pantherinae subfamily, the oldest branching point among all surviving cat lineages, meant that the clouded leopard had been on its own evolutionary path longer than any other living cat. And because it branched off earliest, its DNA carried the least accumulated drift from the ancestral template, the common genetic starting point that the saber-tooth's lineage also traces back toward. There was also a physical detail that researchers had been discussing informally for years without the genetic data to attach it to anything concrete. Experts had long called the clouded leopard the modern saber-tooth cat because of its massive canines, not because the teeth rival a saber-tooth in absolute length, but because relative to skull size, the clouded leopard's upper canines are purporting, ionally longer than those of any other living cat. Longer than a lion's, longer than a tiger's, longer than anything else in the surviving family. It is a subtle distinction when you look at photographs, but the measurements make it clear. The clouded leopard sits at the extreme end of the living tooth length spectrum, the end closest to the direction the saber-tooth took to its logical conclusion. The jaw mechanics reinforce the picture further. The clouded leopard can open its jaw to an angle approaching 95 degrees, nearly twists the gape of a lion, which maxes out around 65 degrees. That extreme range of motion is not incidental. A saber-tooth needed exactly that kind of jaw geometry to deploy its elongated canines effectively. Teeth that long are useless if the jaw cannot open wide enough to clear them on the way into prey. The clouded leopard does not have saber-tooth length canines, but it preserved the jaw architecture that would have made them functional, long after any evolutionary pressure to maintain that geometry should have relaxed. It eyes a structural echo, a blueprint retained in the skeleton of an animal that no longer needs it in its most extreme form, but whose lineage appears to have kept it because the lineage itself is old enough to have carried it forward from a time when that geometry was more central to what the cat family was doing. None of this, on its own, would have been enough to draw a scientific conclusion. Teeth and jaw angles are anatomy, and anatomy is a WH that misled researchers about the saber-tooth for a century and a half. But the genome comparison was not anatomy. It was genetic disto. And C measured position by position across thousands of markers, producing a ranked list that pointed consistently at the same animal. The anatomical observations about the clouded leopard, the teeth, the jaw, the ancestral phylogenetic position did not drive the F-ending. They validated it after the fact. The DNA came first, and the DNA said the same thing the teeth and the jaw had been quietly hinting at since the 1990s, without anyone being in a position to take those hints seriously. Understanding why the clouded leopard came up as the closest match requires a precise understanding of what closest actually means in this context, because it is easy to misread the finding in a way that makes it more dramatic than it is, or alternatively, to dismiss it as less meaningful than the data actually support. The saber-tooth is not the ancestor of the clouded leopard. The clouded leopard is not a descendant of the saber-tooth. There is no direct parent-to-child relationship running between them. What the genome comparison was measuring was something more subtle and, once understood, more illuminating than a simple family connection. Picture the cat family as a tree. At the very base of the trunk, roughly 22 to 25 million years ago, there is a split. One branch goes off to the left and becomes the saber-tooth lineage, Homotherium, Smilodon, and all their relatives, a group that was C. They diversify across 5 continents and persist for tens of millions of years before vanishing entirely. The other branch continues upward and becomes every living cat on Earth. Now move up that second branch, the living cat branch, and look for where the first side chasse departs from the main line. That first departure, the earliest branching event in the entire living cat family, is the clouded leopard. Taxonomic and molecular studies have indicated that Neophalis is sister to the Panthera lineage of cats, and that these two lineages comprise the subfamily Pantherinae, the earliest diverging clade among all extant Felidae. Everything else, every other surviving cat species, branches off higher up the trunk at points progressively further from the base. Because the clouded leopard departed from the main line so early, it has had more time accumulating changes on its own independent path. But it also left the trunk at the point closest to the base, which means the DNA it carried when it departed was closer to the ancestral template than the DNA carried by any species that branched off later. Think of it as distance from a source. Every species that split off further up, the trunk moved further from the genetic starting point before departing. The clouded leopard took the earliest exit, which was the exit positioned nearest to where the saber-tooth's road also began. That proximity to the base is what the genome comparison was detecting. Not shared adaptations, not a hunting relationship, not a direct lineage. Proximity to a common origin, the tida, both the saber-tooth and the clouded leopard trace back toward from their separate branches. This distinction matters because it reframes what the finding actually tells us. The clouded leopard is not a window into how the saber-tooth lived. It is a window into what the cat family looked like before it became everything it is today. It preserves, more than any other living species, the genetic signature of the ancestral stock from which both the saber-tooth's line and the entire living cat family originally diverged. In that sense, it is less a relative of the saber-tooth specifically, and more a relic of the moment before them. What the genome study also produced, beyond the family tree finding, was a portrait of the saber-tooth itself that no fossil had ever been able to provide. Bones preserve shape. DNA preserves biology. And the biology the genome revealed was, in several respects, complete. Eli, at odds with the animal researchers, had been describing for decades based on physical evidence alone. The genetic makeup of the saber-tooth hinted towards scimitar-toothed cats being highly skilled hunters. They likely had very good dating, vision, and displayed complex social behaviors. They had genetic adaptations for strong bones and cardiovascular and respiratory systems, meaning they were well suited for endurance running. Each of those findings, taken individually, is surprising. Taken together, I describe an animal that does not resemble any cat alive today, and that operates by a logic almost completely foreign to how people have always imagined the saber-tooth functioning. Start with the vision. The conventional image of the saber-tooth is an ambush predator, heavy, powerful, lurking in vegetation, waiting for prey to come within striking range before launching a short, explosive attack. That is the model built from anatomy and from comparisons with modern large cats, particularly leopards and tigers, which operate on broadly similar principles. Ambush hunters and motor and ecosystems tend to be crepuscular or nocturnal, active in low light when prey is least alert and cover is most effective. The genome, ion, high color discrimination and sharp resolution in bright conditions. The visual profile of an animal built to operate in full DA light, not to wait in shadow. Then there was the endurance data. The gene clusters associated with cardiovascular and respiratory capacity, with skeletal reinforcement for sustained physical output, pointed not toward the explosive, short-burst musculature of a sprinting predator, but toward the long distance stamina of an animal that pursues prey over extended distances until exhaustion forces the prey to stop. Researchers concluded that saber-tooth cats likely hunted in packs until their prey reached exhaustion, with an endurance-based hunting style during day twilight hours. That combination, pack coordination, daytime activity, pursuit over distance, does not describe any living cat. It describes something closer to an African wild dog or a wolf in its hunting logic, but scaled up to the size of a lion and equipped with CA9 teeth that could kill prey that no pack animal alive today could bring down. The behavioral gene markers completed the picture. Variants associated with social cohesion, group coordination, and cooperative behavior appeared throughout the genome at levels inconsistent with a solitary predator. The saber-tooth was, by the evidence of its own DNA, a social animal. It hunted in groups, it communicated, it coordinated. Everything the skeleton had suggested about a lone lurking ambush specialist was, genetically speaking, wrong. The behavioral portrait that emerged from the genome reframes the extinction in a way that pure fossil evidence never could. For decades, the saber-tooth's disappearance was treated as a straightforward casualty of environmental collapse. The megafauna died, the prey base disappeared, the predator followed. That explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete because it does not account for why the saber-tooth specifically could not adapt when so many other predators survived the same transition. The genome provides the missing V variable. An animal built for cooperative daylight pursuit of enormous prey is not simply a predator that lost its food source. It is a predator whose entire behavioral and physiological architecture was constructed around a world that no longer existed. The hunting synty strategy, the social structure, the visual system optimized for open ground daylight pursuit. Every one of those adaptations assumed a landscape populated by the giant herbivores that had sustained the saber-tooth lineage for tens of millions of years. When those animals disappeared, the saber-tooth did not have the flexibility to redirect. A solitary ambush predator like a leopard can scale its targets downward. It can shift from large prey to medium prey to small prey as conditions change because its hunting method, patience, concealment, a short explosive attack, works across a wide range of target sizes. The saber-tooth's method did not scale. You cannot run a cooperative endurance pursuit against a rabbit. You cannot use social coordination and daylight stamina to warn the smaller, faster, more agile animals that replaced the megafauna after the Ice Age collapse. The current geological period is the first time in 40 million years that Earth has lacked saber-tooth predators. We just missed them, as one of the study's authors noted, a statement that carries more weight once you understand how long that lineage actually ran, and how abruptly it ended. The timeline of the saber-tooth family is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the most extraordinary records of predatory persistence in the history of land mammals. Different saber-tooth species appeared, diversified, spread, and were replaced by successor species across a span approaching 42 million years. They survived multiple ice ages. They colonized every major landmass except Australia, and Antarctica. Their fossils have been found on every single continent except Australia and Antarctica, which means the saber-tooth F family, across its various species, achieved a geographic range matched by almost no other predatory lineage in the fossil record. The L-iving cat family has existed for roughly 11 million years. The saber-tooth family outlasted it more than 3 times over, and it still has not been replaced. Nothing alive today occupies the ecological niche the saber-tooth held. What the genome study did, beyond resolving the family tree question and reconstructing the animal's biology, was close a loop that had been open since the first saber-tooth fossil was identified. Science had the bones, it had the teeth, it had a century and a half of anatomical analysis. What it did not have was the molecular evidence to place the saber-tooth correctly within the broader story of cat. Evolution, or to describe what the animal actually was in biological terms rather than structural ones. The 2020 study provided both. And in doing so, it produced a finding that the anatomy had been actively pointing away from for generations. Not because the anatomists were careless, but because convergent evolution is genuinely deceptive and because the tools available before ancient DNA science matured were simply not capable of detecting what the genome eventually revealed. The clouded leopard, meanwhile, continues its quiet existence in the forests of Southeast Asia, largely unnoticed outside of conservate ion circles. Its status is listed as vulnerable. Both species of the wildcat, the Sunda clouded leopard and the mainland clouded Leopard, are on the endangered species list, with global populations of roughly 5,000 of each. Its range has contracted significantly over the last century as forest cover across its habitat has been reduced by logging, agricultural expansion, and human settlement. The animal that carries the most archaic surviving version of cat DNA on the planet, the living species whose genome sits closest to the base of the entire cat family tree, is declining toward thresholds that conservation biologists regard with serious concern. There is something structurally unsettling about that fact when placed alongside the Saber-Tooth story. The Saber-Tooth ran for 42 million years and left nothing. No descendants, no surviving lineage, no species carrying its specific adaptations forward into the present. Its extinction was total in a way that few predator extinctions are. Not the replacement of one species by a successor, but the termination of an entire evolutionary branch with no continuation anywhere. And the closest living genetic connection to that branch, the animal whose DNA provides the clearest window back to where the cat family began, is itself under pressure from the same 4C that has reshaped or eliminated so many other ancient lineages. The expansion of human activity into every remaining habitat on Earth. The saber-tooth did not survive a rapid reorganization of its world. Whether the clouded leopard will survive its own is a question that conservation programs across Southeast Asia are actively working to answer without certainty about the outcome. What is certain is what the genome study established. When researchers compared the DNA of every living cat against the most complete saber-tooth genome us, for assembled, they were looking for the animal that had stayed closest to a shared origin across more than 20 million years of independent evolution. Every measurement, every marker, every calculated distance pointed at the same answer. Not the largest cat, not the most powerful cat, not the one anatomy had been indicating for 150 years. A spotted, tree-climbing, wide-jawed CA, T in the forests of Borneo and Sumatra, carrying in its genome the oldest surviving echo of what cats were before they became everything we know them as today. That is what the data found. And it is a stranger result than anyone, going into that study, had any reason to expect.